recorded live.
Welcome. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. We want to thank all of you for joining us today. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. I remember when I first started this program back in around 1999 when I began to interview best-selling authors, celebrities, and the like, that I came across our guest who's joining us today, and I thought to myself, here's somebody who really seems to have some insight, especially around that time in 1999 and into the 90s and the late 90s and the new early millennium, is that there seemed to be this big New Age spiritual movement. But to me, it seemed that people were always playing around with it, being playful with it, but nobody really, it seemed, was taking any real responsibility for the information they were providing. Not so with our guest today, who's going to be joining us here on the program. I've discovered that also listening to her in different tapes and picking up the opportunities to read some of her books, such as Illuminata, I said, now here's somebody who really understands something, especially the human dynamic of being spiritual, I suppose, for lack of a better word, and being able to just grab life and just live it. And I think what was really interesting when you consider what our show is about as we talk about being beyond 50, if you will, that a lot of people think that they're at the end of the line. But it seems that we're in a new transition moving out of course, the industrial age in and out of the informational age, that we're finding out it's not true anymore, that no longer do we have to have a crisis at midlife, but this should be a time for discovery. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program is New York Times best-selling author Marianne Williamson, and we're going to be talking with her about her new book, The Age of Miracles, Embracing the New Midlife. And Marianne, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your kind words.
You betcha. As I said, it was about 1997, actually, when I first heard your name through a friend of mine, and she suggested that I pick up your book, Illuminata, which I didn't take the opportunity at that time to get. But as I got started with the program in 1999, I was coming across these different tape series. One of them was from, I guess it was the Quest Life Trilogy series. And I thought, wow, what you have to say really hits it right on the mark versus what I was experiencing in the New Age community. What do you think was going on there?
Well, first of all, I have to tell you, I have colleagues of mine who I think of as extremely involved in the world. And so I think in a way, it's interesting. I once read a statistic, which was that out of a class of medical school graduates, I don't know if this is still true, but when I read it, in the medical school graduating classes, the top 2% became psychiatrists, and the bottom 2% became psychiatrists. So I laughed to myself when I read that, because I thought that there was something similar going on with the sort of higher consciousness movement. You see the brightest, most cutting-edge thinkers, and then you do see people who clearly are sort of, dancing with their neuroses and, painting it purple. So, for every, person that you might be referring to, I have colleagues that I think of as very involved in work in the world, and serious work in the world, and transforming institutions. So, the premise itself is a little problematical for me, because I think in that sense, my colleagues in a way maybe get a bad rap with that sort of supposition. I don't think of myself as the only person, writing those kinds of books who was involved in things. I remember when we did this prayer vigil around Bosnia, and I remember calling James Redfield and Neil Donald Walsh, and we all went to Washington. And, I have many colleagues that maybe haven't initiated certain things, but in my experience have certainly been there when I've called.
Absolutely, and that's just it, is not painting the picture purple and making it other than what it is, but simply embracing what it is, as you were saying, and actually being proactive and being alive is what it really means to be. And I think that's why your work has been so important, is to show people that in each and every one of us is that light, that spirit that needs to go out and illuminate the world. And when you hold that back, and especially if you decide to do that as you're approaching your midlife and saying, well, I'm too old, it's all over for me, that's the time it should be burning the hardest and the brightest. And I know that that's what you like to talk about here in your book, The Age of Miracles.
Absolutely. I think that when you live if you're living in the United States today, I think usually by the mid-40s, somewhere around there, I don't know of anybody really who doesn't face at least one serious emotional body blow. It might be financial, bankruptcy, career. It might be divorce, addiction, health problems, some issue with your children. I mean, there are so many ways that a person can get knocked down. And the longer you've lived on this earth, the more probability there is, simply because you've experienced more, that something knocked you down. And I think by the time we're in our 50s, the ego has a lot of evidence gathered to convince you that given what has happened, the accumulated layers of heartache, the accumulated layers of disappointment, the ways you haven't always gotten it right, the ways maybe you've succeeded at this, but you've also failed at that. There's just such an arsenal. And then you add to those thought forms, which are self-generated, you add to that the thought forms that bombard you from the culture, thought forms like over the hill. He or she won't want you anymore. They're not dating people your age anymore. They're not hiring people your age anymore. So, every situation we're in is experienced within the context of a conversation, whether it's a conversation in our head or a conversation in our culture. And that's the challenge of midlife because, you've taken some hits, you've been through some things, and just about the time when you might think, well, at least I've learned. At least I'm better now. I wasn't responsible before, but I'm responsible now. I wasn't humble before, but I'm humble now. I wasn't wise before, but I'm wise now. Just that point when you could move into that, and you could realize that life really is this spiral where everything you didn't learn before is coming back around again, and this is very exciting because now you know what you're doing. Just at that time, these thought forms like over the hill, you're too old, it's too late for you, begin to make their way into your thinking. And that's where the proverbial crisis comes from.
Now, I know in the popular movie Peggy Sue Got Married, she had the opportunity to go back and visit her life, but now she was old enough with the wisdom and the experience to realize that she probably knew better, but then kind of took a look and said, well, wait a minute, this wasn't so bad. So it's quite interesting when you kind of reflect on your earlier years and you realize, well, maybe it wasn't as bad as you think, and so therefore you don't have to hold on to the regret that you think you should, which can quickly degenerate you and age you faster than I think you want to.
Yeah, but I think sometimes the experience is almost the opposite of that. Sometimes you look back and realize it's worse than you were even conscious enough to realize at the time, and you're appalled by your irresponsibility of your youth or the fact that when you were younger you took life so casually. So I think that conscious aging does involve layers of grief. There is such a thing as healthy shame and healthy regret and healthy remorse. And this becomes a deeply spiritual process of atonement, asking of forgiveness, making of amends, asking God to help you become a better person now. It's not for sissies. I'm not saying that transitioning from midlife crisis to midlife process is necessarily easy, but I'm saying the rewards of doing it are very great. The way I look at it is that I see this period of midlife, the 50-ish period, as much like a second puberty. In the first puberty, the persona of the child fades away and the adolescent comes forth. And what's interesting about that first puberty is in societies, ethnic groups, cultures, families who are conscious enough to mark the transition in an honorable, appropriate, respectful way, the child does much better. And if the mark and the transition is not honorably marked, the child subconsciously feels the need to mark it anyway. It could be body piercing, immoderate sex, drugs, etc. And I think something very similar happens with the second transition. Because we don't honor it, because we don't mark it, the person subconsciously feels the need to mark it anyway because the psyche knows something's changed. I'm not who I used to be. The persona of the young adult fades away. And as we now begin to mark it, and that's what hopefully that's the conversation I hope my book contributes to. Otherwise, the person subconsciously marks it with, a crazy new car, crazy new family, some out-pictured, I got to mark this, I got to change. Or, as is often the case, I think, just an unacknowledged period of depression. You don't even know why you're depressed. So I think that for us to understand is, you never hear 13-year-old complaining that they're not 9 anymore.
Isn't that true?
But with the second puberty, it's different. You know, age can hit you like a truck, and you go around for years more in reaction to what you're not anymore than to what you are now. And that's what I hope that this book, you know, contributes to. Is that conversation. I think youth, the years of a young adulthood, it's a party. And I'm glad I got to go to the party. I think it's a beautiful party. Youth is a beautiful party. Young adulthood is a beautiful party, and the lucky among us get to go to it. But there is a time when it's time for that party to end. And that's what Carl Jung said that I quoted at the beginning of the book. The program of life's morning is different than the program of life's afternoon. And what was big in the morning, something about what was true in the morning will at evening have become a lie. It's a new set of dynamics. And the more we start articulating and embracing and treating in an honorable and respectful way what the dynamics of the new maturity are, then the better off will be. You know, there was, and this is something, by the way, much bigger than, resigned or, yes, you come to accept things and you're resigned. That's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm not talking about a new quietude. I'm talking about a new level of maturity and depth, and out of that comes anything but a resigned quietude. Out of that comes a whole new level of dance, I think. I did see that in the New York Times, front page of the New York Times, about 2-3 months ago, there was a very disturbing report. I don't know if you saw this. I would think you'd find it very interesting for your program. Among Americans 45 to 54, in the last 5 years, there has been a rise of 31% in our suicides.
Wow.
The suicide rate has risen 31% among Americans 45 to 54. That's staggering.
Well, it's actually very alarming when you think about it, because the fact that you got that far with all of the challenges that you can have in life.
Exactly. Exactly. Isn't that tragic? Exactly.
Amazing. Now, what I really enjoy, too, is I did read the book, but it had been at least a week or two. We were going to get together and something happened. That's okay. That's what you prepare for when you're in these kind of shows. But what was interesting is that I remember when I started doing the show, and one of our first shows that we did was on a book called The Creative Age, where this gentleman spent 30 years studying aging. And when I picked up this book, I said, this absolutely should be one of our first shows. I'd actually interviewed him before on the same book, but as we started Beyond 50, I said, this is somebody we must have on the show. And at the time, I was in my early 30s. And as I was looking through this book, I became so inspired by what he was sharing and realizing the real creative age, or even as you like to title in your book, the age of miracles. That is so true. I started to realize most of the big things that were invented by people who were approaching midlife.
Really?
Most of the big accomplishments that people were achieving were achieved approaching and going beyond midlife.
Is that, I'd be fascinated to see that list, because I would love to know that, because I myself, we all know the classic example of Abraham Lincoln. But
right.
Besides Abraham Lincoln, I know Mary Baker Eddy. Now, she didn't start writing her work on Christian Science until she was in her 50s. But in general, I think we could all use more examples. I'd love to have them myself.
Yeah, and as I was saying, he talks about what aging is and the process, and this was a 30-year study that he did. And on the side of the pages as you go through is there could be a woman 63 years old who got involved in this. The women's movement, what was her name? Mary Cady Stanton, I believe?
Oh, yeah, Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Elizabeth, okay, I'm sorry. And they talked about how her brother pretty much her whole life just told her she would never amount to anything, and it wasn't until she was past the age of 50 that she started this.
Wow.
But the point is here I was as a young man, and I was a little frustrated even as I approached 30, thinking, well, I haven't done too much with my life, as I think all of us get to an age where we start thinking that. And I began to read this book, and I thought, God, the best years of my life are still ahead of me. And it's just so sad that you could see people who are approaching getting into their 40s or their 50s or even their 60s, and they tend to have that attitude like it's all over and they surrender. And I know that's what you were talking about earlier, but what we try to do on this program is inspire you to realize, do you know the best years of your life are still ahead of you? Use them.
Whether they're the best or not, the point is that that's up to you.
Right.
You could be 50 years old in America today. You could still have decades left. And inertia means the tendency of the object to move in whatever direction it's been moving. So if you don't make them the best years of your life, they might not be. The point is that this is the point to get very conscious, because if you go into this period of life unconsciously, there's pain ahead. It's reasonable to assume that there's suffering ahead. But if you go into this period of life consciously, willing to do the internal work and have the new conversation, then it's a whole new ballgame.
Now,
a whole new period of rebirth.
Right. Now, I know that you you were sharing in your book that you became a student of a course in miracles. Describe what that is and how that had an effect on you becoming a lecturer and being able to inspire others.
A Course in Miracles has been described as a system, a self-study program of spiritual psychotherapy. It is a psychological mind training. It's not a religion. It's based on universal spiritual themes. And it trains the mind. It dismantles a thought system based on fear that all of us have been taught merely living in this world, and to accept instead a thought system based on love. And it's the goal of the Course, the practical goal of the Course, is the attainment of inner peace. And the means of that attainment is the practice of forgiveness.
Now, as I'm looking and trying to brush up on trying to remember as I was reading in your book, now you talk about that people through life tend to learn through joy or pain.
The Course in Miracles, it says that it isn't up to you what you learn. It's merely up to you whether you learn through joy or through pain. The spiritual perspective posits that life is a set of lessons, that what's going on here is the evolution of the soul. And as we evolve into beings more and more capable of making the soul and the compassion of the soul and the love of the soul manifest on earth, that's what's going on here. And to whatever extent we failed in the past, the lesson comes back around again. And that, by the way, is why this idea, it's too late for me now, is bogus. It's incorrect. As long as you're alive, that universal pattern of death and rebirth continues. And if there's a lesson that you didn't get, it is coming back around again. It's coming back around again whether you're 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. As long as you're alive, there are lessons to be learned.
Now, as people learn and they grow and they get to a point, as you said, you start living the years and you start being in the experiences that you're involved with, regret certainly is one of those things that come to the horizon, especially as you get older. We tend to regret the things we did, and then we'll tend to also regret the things that we didn't do.
Right.
In the age of miracles, how could that be a great transformational process to I guess, live and embrace that regret that you feel and actually learn and grow from it?
Well, the issue is, even if you got it wrong, and it's important, healthy shame is a good thing. Sometimes regret and remorse are important. But ultimately, you don't want to stay stuck in guilt. The discomfort has to rise up. You have to face those demons. But ultimately, the question is this: was that a catalyst for your own personal growth? Are you a better person now? Yeah, we know you were irresponsible in 1985. Are you more responsible now? Yeah, we know that you were not a good steward of your resources. Yeah, we know that you played life casually, or you weren't responsible towards your marriage or your money or your career or whatever it was. But are you better now? Are you wiser now? Are you willing and able to live from a deeper, more mature, wiser, more responsible place now? That's the question. Did you learn from it? And in that sense, you come to understand that, your mistakes and your failures were some of your biggest teachers. But it's not over. God specializes in new beginnings, and the last thing that could ever slow him down is that you're older than you used to be.
Very well put.
God is not so easily slowed down. God doesn't look at you and say, I'd love to do great things with you, but hell, you're over 60. My hands are small.
Absolutely
you
true.
You play God small when you play yourself small.
Now, as you've grown and developed, and you talk also about your daughter as well and about how unique as your own children, you realize it was just yesterday they were babies and now here they're teenagers or they're moving into their early 20s and they're taking on careers. And it's so amazing, and I've often thought about this myself, and I even hear this sometimes from other people, is this. It's amazing when we were young and it seemed like time took forever. Christmas couldn't even get here fast enough. And now we blink and 3 Christmases have gone by. And we start getting into that time awareness. And now you talk about in your book, The Age of Miracles, in the Bible it states, and time shall be no more. So where is it that our perception of time as we were young changed as we got older?
Well, metaphysically, the idea here is that the shallower your thought forms, the faster life goes.
Wow.
The faster time goes. The deeper your thought forms, the slower time goes. So there, Einstein said time and space are illusions of consciousness. So there's a very real way that if you deepen as you get older, you literally have more time between 50 and 70, let's say, than you had between 20 and 40. Things were literally moving faster, literally. So if they move slower, you have more time.
Interesting. Very interesting point. Now, also the ego seems to be one of those playful rascals in there that kind of gets you really confused about your view of yourself and your perception of the world. How does one, I guess, come to terms with that?
Well, the way books like A Course in Miracles use the term ego, it is far more virulent than playful rascal. It is the embodiment of your self-loathing.
I was trying to be compassionate about ego a little bit.
Well, you can't. It is the absence of compassion. It is the anti-life force. It is that which would lure us away from love, lure us away from compassion, and it is literally the root of all evil. And it exists within all of us as nothing more than a temptation to perceive without love. Mm-hmm. And the purpose of our lives is to transcend it. Because it is fear itself. And fear, the only antidote to fear is love. The Course in Miracles says that fear is to love what darkness is to light. It's not a thing. It's the absence of a thing. And so the more we experience and embrace the belief that we are one with God, one with each other, one with the earth, that there's a divine unity at work in the ultimate reality of things, that ultimately disperses the false belief in our separation. And belief in separation is where all problems arise from. Believing we're separate from the earth, we think that we can dominate the earth. Thinking we're separate from other people, we go to war with other people. Feeling separate from God, we feel distressed and depressed and neurotic and in pain. As that false belief is corrected, then we are returned to our right minds. And as we return to our right minds, then and only then can we contribute to the healing of the world. That's the spiritual perspective.
Now also, too, what I'll tend to feel solace in is that if I feel that I'm in a difficult situation, is that I try to think of others who may be in more challenging situations than I'm in. And I remember as I was following that philosophy, if you will, there was a girl who had just broke up with her boyfriend and was really feeling down and out, the end of the world, so forth. And I was talking with her about it, and I said, well, if this gives you any comfort, you must understand that there are people out there who are having a harder time in their lives than you are. And so take some comfort and just reflect the fact that you have this free opportunity to feel what you're going through and that it won't last forever. The most alarming thing happened the very next day, and that was 9/11. And so in going back to work, she looked at me and she says, you know, you're absolutely right. And I said, I didn't mean to be right on that level.
I'm sorry.
No, and it just, to me, was a very strange thing that had happened. And Yeah, to see something that I would suggest go into a magnitude like that, it was just, to me, almost bordered on the phenomenal in some ways.
I tell two stories in the book because, well, I tell more than that, but two stories specifically about that. The idea that some people rise up out of their past. They put the past behind them and recreate. And some people stay stuck and they can't get out of it. You know, my husband left me, I can't get over it. There are people who, you know, stay stuck in victimization for decades. You know, my husband abandoned me, I can't move forward. You know, you come to understand if your husband left you 20 years ago, who was the real culprit? The husband who left you or the part of yourself that has let 20 years go by without getting over it? So I tell two stories in the book. One is about a woman named Naomi, who is a Holocaust survivor.
I was just about to ask you about her. I'm on that very page.
Exactly. She between the ages of 21 and 23, I think, right? She was in Auschwitz, for God's sakes. And yet she came out having lost her mother, having lost her sister-in-law, having lost her husband, and yet she came out today. She's in her late 80s. I did a program with her the other night at the Holocaust Museum in Houston. She's extraordinary. She's got 3 children. She's been an amazing mother, an amazing businesswoman, very, very successful, happy, amazing. And I look at people like that and I go, I think I have had problems.
Yes, exactly.
So that's exactly what you're saying. And you're absolutely right. You get to a point in life where your salvation lies in knowing you're not the only one suffering here.
Mm-hmm. Now, why is it that you think people like to stay stuck in that victim role when they know that there's an opportunity to be able to stretch beyond what they believed, and they just hold on to this suffering when it really doesn't serve or make any sense? But then I've also come to understand that, well, it must be serving them, otherwise they wouldn't continue in it.
Absolutely.
How does one move through that?
Well, that goes back to that concept of the ego.
Okay.
The ego, the mind is split between the mind that is in touch with the spirit and the truth about us, and this ego mind, which is this temptation to perceive in a wrong-minded way. And to the ego, pain is a peak experience. And the thoughts of fear, according to the Course in Miracles, a thought system of fear dominates the world in which we live. And so the Course says the ego speaks loudest and the ego speaks first. So to the ego, you are a victim. The ego will tell you that you're a victim. The ego will tell you that you're not good enough. The ego will tell you that you have so much to be afraid of. And big time, the ego will tell you you're too old. So the ego mind is you know, the problem of humanity. But we are on this earth in order to evolve past it into this belief, not that we are separate, but that we are one. And how do we do that? Only through spiritual practice of some kind. It is not an intellectual shift. That is where prayer comes in. That's where meditation comes in. That's where forgiveness comes in. That's where serious spiritual practice and living life in a more devoted and loving way. It's the only way to move past the bondage of the ego. The Course in Miracles says, in any given moment, you are either host to God or hostage to the ego. You are either opening your heart in love, you're opening your heart in compassion, you're opening your heart in forgiveness, you're showing up for life, you're contributing, you're doing your best to be of service, you're trying to live in integrity and excellence. You are either doing that or your ego mind will have a heyday with you. So if you're not putting on the light, the darkness will be there, and that's just the way it is.
I remember some time ago when I was doing a show, and it was about how to transform through crisis. And the gentleman, it was really interesting how he made me think about how we tend to think about ourselves. And sometimes it can be quiet or sometimes it can be screaming at you. And that simply was that he had asked the question to his son, do you think that I am a good father? And the son simply replied, as children in their wisdom seem to have, even sometimes more than adults all find.
First of all, before you answer, how old was the son?
The son was probably about 5 years old, I'm guessing.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so he was a young boy. But that's what I found even amazing with my own children, is the wisdom sometimes you could find if you would just sit and listen. And the answer from the young boy was simply this: you are a better father than you think you are. And it's really amazing, and I'm sure that as you've done lectures and talks and worked with people, my understanding, pretty much around the world, do you find that to be a running theme, that sometimes people aren't as good as they, or not quite as good, or you know what I mean, what I'm trying to get at here, that they usually think that they're less than they truly are.
You know, there is a quote, a paragraph from my first book, A Return to Love. And in some way that I don't have a clue how this happened, but somebody lifted it and sort of spread the word around, I guess, that it was a quote from Nelson Mandela's inaugural address. And it begins, our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. And that's just a quote from do you know that quote?
Yes, I'm very familiar. In fact, there was a day I was having a hard time, and I think it was that very book. I opened up to the right page where you talk about become the light, because when you do, it automatically gives permission for others to do the same.
That's the end of that paragraph, exactly.
See, I told you I read your stuff.
Yeah, thank you. Well, when that first happened, it was everywhere, and it was quoted, misattributed to Nelson Mandela, et cetera. After my own sort of personal reaction, what? I found myself just so interested that of all the paragraphs, because if you write books, you've written many paragraphs. So I used to think to myself, why that paragraph? But I think that paragraph because of exactly what you just said. People realize that there is a weakness within themselves that they've been holding on to, and that our deepest fear is not the darkness. The deepest fear is the light that lies beyond. In the Course in Miracles, it says, and this, I remember when I first read this, I knew this book was for me. In the Course in Miracles, it says, the ego doesn't tell you that you did something wrong. The ego just tells you that you are wrong. And I thought, that's it. It wasn't even like I could say, Marianne, you blew it this way, you blew it that way. I was too young to even have a case to build against myself. But I just felt that other people were decent. If something was wrong, other people had the password, other people had what it takes, and I didn't. There was something wrong with me. And that's what the ego would tell you. And, of course, as you get older, this is why aging matters, because once you get older, the ego does have a case. Don't you remember what you did in the 70s? Huh?
Right.
Don't you remember the 80s? Remember? You could have had that job, couldn't you? Remember how you blew that marriage? Remember your kids used to like you. You know what I'm saying? There's so many things. So as you get older, it's like, oh, my God. And that's what we're talking about here, not getting crushed under the weight of all that. Rising up out of those ashes better than ever, ready to shine.
For those of you just joining us, you're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and we're talking with best-selling author Marianne Williamson and her book, The Age of Miracles. Now, what's really interesting, too, as we get older is we tend to find that we may be single, for instance, or we may be in a relationship that perhaps no longer serves us. And we feel that we're now at an age, well, do I have time to perhaps find somebody new or be with somebody new? Do I have that opportunity for us? And what was interesting, as you talk about in your book, is the way that men and women's thinking seems to have changed on the playing field, whereas the women are more masculine and the men are becoming more feminine, sort of going out of the way to show how sensitive they are. And you talk about how that really should change, that we should allow men to be men, not maybe too overly masculine, but men to be men and women to be women. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that in our generation of adults, every man was afraid sometimes to own his own masculinity in fear that women and others would see him as macho. And women were afraid to own our own femininity in fear that this would be seen as weak. And so there's been a lot of confusion. And men have gotten in touch with their feminine side, sometimes at the expense of their masculine, and women have gotten in touch with their masculine side, sometimes at the expense of their own feminine. And I think that there's a rebalancing and correcting process that is going on right now. Women want to be women, and men want to be men. And even though I know that as we age, there's some hormonal shifts in the opposite direction, I think it's also true and important that we realize that as long as a man is alive, he's a man. And as long as a woman is alive, she is a woman. And I think a lot of women, I can't speak so much about men, but I think a lot of women reach their 50s and feel like, I closed myself off to that most glorious aspect of my personhood. I didn't allow myself to be the inner divine feminine. And so sometimes it's around our 40s, our 50s, certainly our 50s, our 60s even, where women are saying, I never allowed myself the glamour of my own womanhood, and I'm going to do it now. And, I remember I was walking through a store once, and I saw some outfit, and I thought, I'll never be young and fabulous anymore. And what I got inside was, no, you won't be young and fabulous, but you can be older and fabulous. You don't have to be young to be fabulous. You don't have to be young to be a fabulous man. Look at Clint Eastwood.
Right.
You don't have to be young to be a fabulous woman either.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to give up fabulous.
You never have to give up any of that, especially if it's what you truly desire, because it helps you be excellent in your own feeling of being alive.
Yeah, but I think that we have to give up trying to be fabulous in a way that the young are. It's a different kind of fabulous. The way I talk about it in the book is there are different seasons, and all the seasons are beautiful. Winter is as beautiful as spring in nature and in us. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no, you look at nature photography, there's no season inherently more beautiful, but it's a different season. Mm-hmm. Somebody said to me, some young man said to me on a teleclass once, he said, Miss Williamson, how does it feel to be in the autumn of your life? And I thought that was like, oh, my God. And I remember my response was, well, I have fewer leaves, but the ones I do have are a lot more colorful.
There you go.
Pretty good thinking on my feet there, don't you think?
Yeah, very good. Now, I was just thinking as we were talking throughout this program here about youth and then aging. And what's interesting as we started the program a couple of years, 4 years ago, I believe it was, is that we were tending to sometimes have conversations in the trajectory of, well, we're in such a youth-celebrated culture that pretty much our older generation has been put aside, and that's kind of a shame because when you take a look at how aging around the world looks, it's quite different. They're actually revered. They're honored for their wisdom and their experience. But I said, but don't you see, for instance, in the United States, something really interesting that although it seems to be that we're celebrating youth, to me, I think we're exploiting it by living through them. When you take a look at movies and television and commercials, to me it seems like we're exploiting it, and at times you can probably understand why there is that rift between maybe the 20-somethings and then the 50-somethings.
Yeah,
and that was the middle ground that we wanted to intend with this show, to create a conversation, just to realize we were that once and we're this now, but be good about it rather than exploitative about it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I also think that the elders among us will be treated with greater honor when we behave more honorably.
Exactly.
You have to earn people's honor. You have to earn people's respect. And so you have to ask yourself, do I behave honorably? Do I contribute as an elder? Does my energy show respect for younger people but still demonstrate a wisdom? Because if it does, what I've felt in my life is if I seem stuck, then younger people aren't very interested. But if I continue to grow within myself and have a sense of authenticity that comes from this eternal learning and eternally being who you are now and learning more, then you find that young people are actually attracted to you. There's a lot of talk, this whole thing, generational difference between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And sometimes people say, well, he's more attractive because he's younger. I don't think the problem is that she's older. The problem is that she's stuck. Mm-hmm. She's behaving, her thoughts seem stuck in the past. It's not her age per se. Because if you look at someone like Al Gore, as he has aged, has this kind of authenticity. And to be honest, even John McCain has it. Mm-hmm. I mean, we talk about his age because 71 is getting up there in terms of do we want, should the president, should that be the age of the actual president? But I think John McCain and Al Gore demonstrate this kind of authenticity that makes young people respond positively to them. And Hillary, who is younger, certainly younger than McCain, I don't know if she's younger than Gore or not, but there's something in there that's not about her age. It's about a lack of moving forward on some psychological and emotional and spiritual level.
That's really an interesting way to put that. And I just had this really interesting image about Native American tribes. and the leader of the tribe would tend to be the strongest, the most courageous, but he still took his orders from the elders for the most part.
Oh, absolutely they did. Absolutely they did. It was and it was the elder women, by the way, who decided whether or not to go to war.
Mm-hmm. What's even more interesting when you take a look at tribal societies around the world and even back in history is that the women played just as much of a part in the decisions that were made for the tribe as the men did. They were just as important. You wonder, where has that sort of changed here, and is it possibly moving back to the day when that was going on?
Well, that change was instigated by the early church. I mean, it was called the witch burnings.
Okay.
During the Middle Ages, several 100,000 people died at the stake, about 85-90% of whom were women. And this was an effort on the part of the early church to eradicate the passionate, free-thinking woman. The pagan women were, as you just said, they were extremely important parts of the culture. But if you have an institution which seeks to control people and to in any way suppress their own authentic desire and voice, then you have to get rid of the passionate, free-thinking woman. The passionate, free-thinking woman raises passionate, free-thinking children. And passionate, free-thinking children become adults very difficult to manipulate, almost impossible to control. So that was the evil of that period of history. It was an effort by the early church for which not this pope, but the last pope before him, officially apologized, which did not get the press that I think it deserved. But to me, I know for me, and I think for many women, it was huge. The witch burnings, we're talking about 3 centuries there. So if you have enough generations during which the full actualization of a little girl actually endangers her, and if she becomes a fully actualized woman, she is more likely to die, and I remind you of what kind of death that would be, burning at the stake, then you develop the cultural attitudes of basically keeping girls quiet for their own good. And then once you have the church basically sanction, more than sanction, perpetrate that kind of evil, because the witch burnings were a female Holocaust. So if you have an institution like the church, which would become so all-powerful, perpetrate that evil, and then the implied sanctioning of it in terms of violence towards women, which we are still at the effect of today. And even though we stopped burning witches, we still even today have not totally routed out of Western consciousness some of the prejudices and the suspicion of the powerful female and the prejudices that they are on some level to be controlled, dominated, and done with whatever men want. That's one of the reasons to me why this FLDS, the polygamous compound issue here in Texas, is so interesting. Because I think it does show, and that's another thing about age. My daughter said to me one day, she's 17, and she was so upset about some social injustice or another, and I said, that's the difference between your age and mine, honey. I said, when you're young, you think, oh, this is so terrible and this has got to change. Then you get older and you realize, you know what, it might not change in my lifetime. Evil and injustice and all of that is not as easy to eradicate as we thought it would be. And then you move into the middle years and beyond when you go, well, it's true. It might not end in my lifetime, but it's better than it was. And I think that this polygamous compound issue in Texas is an example of that. We have finally gotten, and it's been in our lifetime, we have finally gotten to zero tolerance around pedophilia and child abuse. And we have finally gotten to a point where you can wrap it in parental permission, you can wrap it in some bogus religious context. It doesn't matter. If you're a culture of pedophilia, we see through that other stuff, and we're going in there and we're getting those kids out. And even though that's not a black and white situation, it's a very difficult and complicated, in many ways tragic situation, I do feel that it shows that the society has grown in its to that point of zero tolerance for violence towards children. And you're talking about violence towards girls, you're talking about 13. And, first they didn't know. I was reading in the paper this morning. They've gone in there. Some of these girls under 16 are pregnant. Some of those girls are getting out of there 16, 17 years old. They already have children. That's called violence towards girls. And we have reached a point, and I'm sort of proud of America on that one. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying the state did everything right, but I think it's interesting. We
it's just
in our own lifetime.
Yeah, it's just as you pointed out when this particular story came to light, as I was discovering it, I believe it was last week, and it was being shared with me, and I thought, it's really glaringly clear that there's a serious problem. Okay, sure, these women are allegedly there because they chose to be there, but I find it interesting that they're very, 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 very young. In fact, not even women, but really girls.
Oh, absolutely.
And they're also pushing out the teenage boys.
Oh, yeah, exactly. You have a 14-year-old girl. That 14-year-old girl doesn't want to marry a 50-year-old man. She wants to go date that 15, 16-year-old boy. So they throw the boys out. Oh, it's evil. There's some deep wickedness there.
I know. It was just like watching this particular documentary that was dealing with the prostitution over in one of the poorest countries in the world over in Asia. And they were saying, that's sad enough, but the sadder part is the fact that there is no middle youth, that there's just the young children and then the adults, but that middle youth is gone, and that's so necessary for particularly rites of passage and aging. And so, but like you said, it sounds very encouraging that we're certainly beginning to see no tolerance, which we should see. And again, when you talk about the witch burnings, as you were talking about the women back in the day, I almost tend to sense that same feeling against the youth of our day and age, as I was talking about earlier, that exploitation, especially in horror movies. It's always the young that are stupid, getting into circumstances and then getting killed, and it's like, who came up with this stuff?
Oh, it's so awful, isn't it? These movies that they're making, like the movie Prom. Yeah, and the sociological evidence is in for these young kids who see so much violence on television and in movies. There is a direct correlation between their exposure to those violent images and their violent behavior. But we're simply not learning that lesson fast enough.
Now, when you produce, what I like about how your book, The Age of Miracles, reads is it seems to come in and out of, you seem to come in and out of and then back in. It's almost like you're in different dimensions as you're thinking, you're reflecting, but then you're saying and suggesting. And you could see that there's a real heart coming through on the book. This isn't something that you read like the typical 300 billion self-help books that are out there. In fact, it's not this at all. It seems to me to be more of an active reflection on the way that we should be approaching and loving who we are. And what I like what you said in the book, and we hear this quite often as we're out doing various shows and talking with the community, it's amazing how many times eyes light up and they mouth out our sign, Beyond 50. I've never heard of that before. But what's interesting is that the people tend to say on a regular basis that I may be 57 or I may be 60, but inside of me I feel that I'm still 15 or whatever age that is.
Right.
And you talk about that in your book.
Well, my father once said to me when he was already in his 80s, he said, when you're old, you don't feel old. And now that I am 55, I know what he means. There's some essential part in you that you feel, well, this is the same me as I was when I was 15 years old. It's only the outer shell that ages. The spirit does not age. The spirit doesn't live in time. And the more you identify with the spirit, the less age matters to you. And that's what the spiritual growth is about anyway. It's about shifting from body identification to spirit identification. And so the more we do, the more we identify our own reality as the spirit within us rather than just the flesh and bone, then the more graceful we're able to be about changes in the physical body.
Again, it's just such a pleasure to have you on our program and have the opportunity to talk with you. Again, for those of you just joining us, we're speaking with New York Times best-selling author Marianne Williamson and her book, The Age of Miracles. Now, how did you come to title this book this way? Because I agree with the title. When you get to this point, you begin to realize the personal power that you have, but then you've had it the whole time, much as Dorothy with the Wizard of Oz. But it seems to transform, and it surfaces in your book so well why that is.
Well, The Age of Miracles, the title is kind of a double entendre. The Age of Miracles meaning the era, but it also means the process of age. And the reason it's the Age of Miracles is because the way the Course in Miracles talks about the word miracle, it's a shift in perception, a shift in thinking, and that's what the book is about. It's about experiencing the aging process in a different way of thinking. And as we experience it, as we think about it differently, it is different, and that's the miracle. You change your thoughts and you change your life.
Yeah, just incredible stuff. It's so interesting to know that it's so uniquely that easy. It's just the work that can sometimes be a little strenuous.
It's interesting, isn't it? The truth is simple. That's not to say it's always easy, is it? But it is simpler sometimes than we make it. But it's easy, it's not that the work is hard, it's getting over our resistance to doing it that's hard. Mm-hmm. And, it can be challenging living in a society like ours, and you look in the mirror and you hear what the society says. It can be, I don't think that this is necessarily an easy process, but the rewards are great, and the consequences of not being willing to do the rethinking and the going back and the cleaning up and atoning for, if we refuse to do that inner work, like I said, you could have decades left and they could get really painful.
Very well. Now, I know that also in your book, The Age of Miracles, sexuality is something that you really like to share and talk about. As you get older, that conversation may or may not be there, and in fact, it seems the common joke is the Viagra joke. But as you talk about the passion, that it seems to transform as you're older from the, oh, my hormones are raging and I just got to be with you and I'm in love, that sexuality you seem to have more, you seem to be guiding it more from the heart. Explain what that's like.
Well, if you are less neurotic about sex, you are more ready for a relationship.
Good way to put it.
The neurotic, obsessive sexual stuff doesn't help build a relationship. It helps often to destroy a relationship. So what I say in the book is heat. The heat doesn't go away. Heat will always be heat. Passion doesn't go away. It might move from chakra to chakra, but the passion itself doesn't go away. Love isn't boring. Life isn't boring as you get older unless you are.
Boring.
If you get boring, then your life is boring. But the issue of excitement has to do with the issue of the human being. As I say in my book, my arms aren't as shapely as they used to be, but I know a whole lot more about what I should be doing with them. In terms of women, what I talk about in the book is that women enter what I call the Priestess Years. And, if a man wants to conceive children, then clearly the younger woman has the goods. But a lot of men, particularly men of a certain age themselves, aren't looking to conceive children so much as that they're looking to conceive the man that they're capable of being. That before they die, they want to become the man that they know they're capable of being. And sometimes for that, a mature woman who has entered her priestess years has a lot more to offer than the young woman who might be able to conceive a child but cannot help him conceive the new version of himself.
Certainly an amen to that.
Thank you.
No, I really enjoyed that you could take a look at this book and you begin to read it and think, well, she seems to kind of be spiritually goody-goody, but as you keep reading through it, you realize that priestess that you're talking about really coming through, and it even borders on the erotic in some ways when you talk about that. I thought that's exactly the healthy way that people should be embracing this, at those particular ages, rather than, oh, the gas pump is all empty now, it's all over for me. What do I got left?
You know what story I heard today? I heard this today. I had lunch with a friend of my mother's, and she told me about a 91-year-old woman who she knows who just married an 87-year-old man. Uh-huh. And the woman has had a double mastectomy. And she said to my friend, it's okay because he's not a breast man.
That reminds me of an interesting story that we had. There was a particular coach, if you will, that we had on our program. This was probably about 4 or 5 months ago. And she said it was really interesting that she had an 86-year-old woman that came in to see her, and this is a health coach, I believe, and she said that she was in there for the specific purpose to learn how to masturbate herself into an orgasm. And I was thinking to myself, well, that's interesting. 86 years old, and she never learned. To me, it was just, there was somebody that was trying to grab life and just continue to live it no matter at what age.
Makes you wonder what she was doing between 20 and 80. You could do a show on that.
Now, Marianne, what do you most hope that when people pick up your book, The Age of Miracles, that they get from your book?
I think every author, sometimes people come up to you in a book line and they show you a book of yours where they've underlined something in yellow or they've underlined something in pink, with a highlighter.
Right.
And it makes you feel so good because, when you write a book, it's a very solitary experience. You don't know if anybody's going to read this or not. Mm-hmm. So I think what I hope for is, I'm sure what on some level every writer hopes for, that something you've written, some insight that you've offered, makes somebody have an aha moment, because we all love those aha moments. Mm-hmm. There's something so rich about reading a book and going, God, that's so true. Yes. That's what I would hope.
I thought I was the only one that thought that way.
No, yeah, exactly. Or like my therapist said to me today, something about how Carl Jung, this is a line from Carl Jung, behind the wound lies the genius. That's such a brilliant line to me. And I just love the thought that maybe something I say or something that I wrote would sort of uplift or broaden somebody's understanding the same way my thoughts are uplifted or my understanding is broadened when I read good books. So that's my hope.
Well, I do know this. As I said, when I first came to know who you were was back about 1997, and then as I began to, I remember the first time that I had heard you was on that tape series. It was called the Quest Trilogy series, where you were with several different speakers, many of whom I've actually met and interviewed on our program and on a different program that I was doing. I thought to myself, I just really wanted the opportunity, and I say this with full respect, to talk with someone like yourself, because to me, you're one of those rare gems out there who really, truly get it, and it shows in your work. And it's only through that people, no matter what age, can grow, as we've been talking about throughout this program today, can grow in being genuine, being authentic, and being who they are. And that's where fear is pushed away. It's abandoned, and you begin to ride that wonderful ongoing roller coaster known as life. And it's certainly through works like yours that will inspire and help transform people to get back on the mark, whatever that mark is, because it's different for everybody. And I'm sure that you've encountered that as you've done lectures and met with people from around the world.
Yeah. Beautifully put. Beautifully put. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you for being on our program today. I hope we get the opportunity to talk again, because it's always a pleasure to have people like you on our program to let you realize that what you want to be saying each day you wake up is bring that horizon to me. And that's the way you should be living. And I can see that that's the way you've been living.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
Oh, my goodness. Much
you bet. Thank you.
Bye.
Our guest today, Marianne Williamson, joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program, and thank you again. And for those of you out there, if you want to find out more about the Beyond 50 radio program, please be sure to join or log into our website, beyond50radio.com. That's beyond50 with the number 50, radio.com. And you'll find out more about Marianne Williamson on our blog. Just click on our blog button. You'll find this nice green frog right at the top of the page. And that's also where we have our past audio files definitely related to the subjects that we've been covering. We hope that you continue to listen and tune in. We're here every Friday from 12 noon to 1, but sometimes we do specialty shows like today with special guests like Marianne Williamson. And also want to encourage you to go ahead and send any questions or comments, because we do embrace what your opinions or ideas about the show are all about. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us today. And remember, live your day past halfway.